Detroit is not a city that was born for shine. Detroit was forged, the city that would shape the team. In the early 20th century, America's heartbeat in Detroit. It was the engine of a new era. Literally, Henry Ford's assembly lines not only produced cars, but a new way of life. The city grew rapidly. Workers from all over the world, Poles, Irish, Italians, African Americans from the South, came to Detroit in the hope of security. The air was thick with metal and ambition. But in that same air hung something else: struggle. The Great Depression hit hard. Work disappeared, factories closed, and the pride of the workers' city was at stake. And somewhere between that dust and that hope, a hockey team would be born. Not just any team. A symbol of everything Detroit was and wanted to be: hardworking, persistent, unbreakable. The birth of Hockeytown, 1926 to 1942. Before the banners, before the legends, there was survival. The first attempt, the Detroit Cougars. It began in 1926. The NHL sought expansion into the bustling industrial cities of America. Detroit, with its economic muscle, seemed a logical choice. But there was one problem: no one there knew hockey. The founders had optimism, but no foundation. No players, no fans, no tradition. They bought the players of the defunct Victoria Cougars from British Columbia.
You can feel the fans, the electricity in the building. The fans really helped us have success.
And with them, also, the name. Thus, the Detroit Cougars were born, a team without roots, without identity, and without a real understanding of what they were starting. The first season, chaotic.
Representing all of hockey with great distinction for 5 decades, number 9.
The Cougars didn't even have a home arena. They had to play their games in Windsor, Ontario, just across the border in Canada. An American team playing its home games in Canada. It sounded like a joke. And for many fans in Detroit, it was that too. The Cougars lost more often than they won. The stands remained half empty. Hockey was still something strange, something for the North. But deep in the city, something began to simmer: curiosity. Olympia Stadium. The harness of steel. In 1927, Detroit Olympia Stadium opened. A colossal structure, 15,000 seats, icy inside, with steel beams that held the sound as if it were trapped in a factory hall. It wasn't a temple of glamour like Madison Square Garden. No, it felt like Detroit, raw, industrial, massive. Here, between smoke and echoes, the city slowly began to learn the game. They heard the clatter of sticks, the scraping of skates, and recognized something of themselves. The worker who came from the factory at night, grease still on his hands, saw in those players his own fighting spirit. Slowly, the bond was forged. A new name, a new soul. Through the early 30s, the Cougars were renamed the Detroit Falcons, but it didn't help. Financial problems made the team shaky. Fans came and went. Until in 1932, a businessman from Montreal took it over, James E. Norris. Norris wasn't a dreamer, he was a strategist. He saw that Detroit didn't just need a team, but an identity. He chose a new symbol, a winged wheel. It was no coincidence. The wheel stood for Detroit's automotive heart. The wing, for speed, aspiration, hope. Thus, out of the ashes of failure, the Detroit Red Wings were born. The years of growth, from surviving to believing. The early Red Wings were not yet champions, but they became stronger, tougher, more confident. The city began to recognize itself in them. Win or lose, they fight, local newspapers wrote. Detroit suffered heavily under the economic crisis of the 1930s. Unemployment rose, but Olympia remained a place of escape. For a few hours a week, people could forget their worries, singing, shouting, frozen in suspense. The breakthrough, 1936 and 1937. Then came 1936. The Red Wings, led by coach Jack Adams, made their first real leap. They played with a physical, direct style that fit their city perfectly. Not finesse hockey, but fighting spirit. In 1936, Detroit won its first Stanley Cup. A year later, they repeated that feat. The victories rumbled through all of Detroit. Newspaper headlines spoke of a workers' team for a workers' city. In the factories, workers shouted, "We built Fords, now we build champions." The team didn't just become successful. It became a symbol of restoration, of pride. Olympia, the crucible of sound. During the late 1930s, Olympia trembled with energy. There were no luxury boxes or jumbotrons, no entertainment or intermission acts. Only fans, hoarse from shouting, children with wool scarves that smelled of smoke and oil, icy air through the concrete halls. Opponents said it sounded as if the building itself was shouting along. The wing on the chest stood for more than sport. It was about the city, about the people who never gave up. 1942, the foundation of a dynasty. When the war years approached, Detroit not only had factories building weapons, it also had a hockey team that had forged identity out of struggle. The Red Wings were no longer a founding club. They were a force. The people had faith. The city had something to cheer for and to hold on to. The foundation of Hockeytown had been laid. Fade out. Images of old black and white footage, workers, children with Red Wing sweaters, the smoke of Olympia, the wing in close-up. A voice whispers, "Every dynasty begins with belief." The Gordie Howe era, 1943 to 1967. The greatest player in the perfect city. Fade in.
If you're going to make a protocol hockey player, who would you pick? You'd pick Gordie Howe.
Well, you can see why Gordie Howe is said to be the greatest player in the history of the National Hockey League.
Images of black and white war production, airplanes, steel, women in factories, sirens, hammers, sparks. Detroit in 1943. Voiceover, in a city where steel was king, a boy from Saskatchewan became the symbol of unbreakability. The era of a legend begins. The year is 1943. The world is still burning in war, but in Detroit, workers open their newspapers every morning with two fixed subjects: war news and the Red Wings. Coach Jack Adams is building a team that doesn't just want to win, it wants to dominate. He looks for players who embody the mentality of the city, tough, humble, unyielding. And then he arrives, a quiet, shy teenager from Floral, Saskatchewan, Gordie Howe. Young Gordie, calm before the storm. Howe's first impression with the Red Wings was modest. He said little. His skates scraped over the ice while others talked. But when the puck dropped, he spoke in another way, physical, deliberate, with an instinct others couldn't explain. They soon called him Mr. Hockey, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he could do everything: score, pass, fight, defend, and always stay standing. A sports journalist of that time called him a worker with the grace of a craftsman and the heart of a machine. The production line, perfection in motion. In the late 1940s, Coach Adams formed his masterpiece, the production line. The name was no coincidence. In the city of Ford, production line was synonymous with efficiency, cooperation, and relentless pace. The lineup: Gordie Howe, strength and balance; Sid Abel, strategy and experience; Ted Lindsay, fire, aggression, chaos. Together, they created something revolutionary: puck movement before brute strength. They moved as one organism, a human factory producing goals in mass production. Their timing was so precise that opponents began to whisper it seemed as though they could read each other without speaking. And maybe they could. For they were all cut from the same wood, sons of workers from a time when survival was a trade. 1950, the double overtime goal game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final, Detroit versus the New York Rangers. The tension biting. Olympia seethed with sound. The clock deep in the second overtime. Players could barely breathe. Then it happened. Pete Babando, a name never meant to be legendary, glided across the ice and shot. The puck hit the net. Detroit exploded. A city hardened by years of labor and war erupted in joy. It was their second Stanley Cup, but perhaps the first that truly felt like their victory. 1952. The perfect playoffs. 2 years later, the Red Wings experienced something incredible: the perfect playoffs. They won every game. No losses, no mercy. 4 rounds, 4 sweeps. The Stanley Cup parade was unprecedented. People hung from factory gates. Children climbed lampposts to catch a glimpse of Lindsay, Abel, and Howe. It seemed as though the whole city was painted red. An old factory worker remembered, "When we saw that cup, it was as if Detroit briefly forgot that it had ever been broken." Olympia in the 1950s, Cathedral of Sound. In these years, Olympia became something sacred, not an arena, but a cathedral of steel. Above, among the beams, hung smoke, partly from cigars, partly from tension. The seats stood close to the ice. It sounded as if the whole building was breathing along. The atmosphere was so intense that opponents said, "In Olympia, you didn't just play against the Red Wings, you played against the whole city." The Red Wings were no longer the underdogs. They were the standard. The 4 times of glory: 1950, 1952, 1954, 1955. 4 Stanley Cups in 6 years, a dynasty built on discipline, strength, camaraderie, and belief. Howe was the core.
Of everything that the game represented in terms of skill, physicality, passion for the game.
He scored hundreds of goals, but it was his elbows, his shots, and his smile, broad and calm, like that of someone who knew he was unbeatable, that made him a legend. They called it the age of Mr. Hockey. More than a player, an ideal. Gordie Howe was more than the best. He was the blueprint for the modern player. He ate like a worker, trained like a soldier, and played like an artist. Every shift was calculated. He always knew where the puck would be. Children in Detroit didn't just talk about Howe. They wanted to be Howe. Workers painted wings on their lunchboxes. Factories began naming their company teams after him. Howe became Detroit. Ted Lindsay, the fighter for equality. But the Howe era was not only about hockey. It was also a time of struggle behind the scenes. Ted Lindsay tried something radical, founding a players' union. At a time when the league treated players like property, Lindsay fought for dignity, for better wages, medical rights, future security. The NHL hated him for it. Detroit's own management sidelined him, and eventually he was traded. But his rebellion planted the seed for what would later become the NHL Players Association. Detroit was not only the center of industry, but also of revolution. 1950s, knowledge becomes culture. Detroit fans began to do something new, understand the game. They didn't just watch, they analyzed. They knew every rule, every formation, every player. Commentators joked, "You can't talk about hockey in Detroit without being corrected by your taxi driver." The city was no longer just a fan of a team. Detroit was the game. The nickname Hockeytown began in whispers, in cafes, in newspaper headlines, in slogans. And it stuck. 1967. The end of an era. Toward the end of the 1960s came the inevitable change. The NHL expanded. New teams, new talents, new markets. Howe grew older, but his presence remained magnetic. Even in his final seasons, one glance from him was enough to make rookies tremble. When he briefly retired in 1971, after 25 seasons, 801 goals, and more than 1,000 memories, it felt as if a factory had shut down its engine for the first time. Detroit didn't just lose a player, it lost its compass. Images of Howe with children on the ice. The wing on his chest gleams in black and white. Some heroes retire, legends never do. Epilogue, the echo of greatness. Howe's spirit lingered in the steel beams of Olympia. Everyone who ever played there smelled the oil, heard the shouting, felt that echo. The city had learned what winning was, and now it had to learn what it was to let go. The time of glory was over. The dark years stood at the door. The camera slowly lowers through the empty stands of Olympia. One spotlight remains on the ice. Fade to black. The dark years, 1967 to 1982. When tradition isn't enough. Black screen. Only the sound of a slowly ticking clock. Then a voice. Every dynasty eventually reaches the point where the past weighs heavier than the future. The silence after the cheers. The curtains of Olympia hung heavy in the 60s. The steel beams that once trembled with cheers now carried only echoes of memory. After the departure of Gordie Howe in 1971, the city lost its symbol, and the Red Wings their sense of purpose. It felt as though the heart had been taken out of Detroit. The team that once represented freedom, pride, and labor slowly began to disintegrate. There was no clear fall, no dramatic collapse, just slowly. Silence. Detroit, the city that fell with them. What happened on the ice mirrored the city outside. Detroit in the 70s was no longer the golden industrial city of Ford and General Motors. The oil shocks, automation, and suburbanization caused an exodus. Factories closed, streets died. The downtown core, once vibrant, became marked by abandoned buildings and unemployment. And in the middle of it all stood the Red Wings, still in red but no longer glowing. Their nickname in the press became mockingly the Dead Wings. The decay of a legendary hall. The Detroit Olympia, once the cathedral of sound, began to creak. Literally. Pipes leaked, seats rusted, walls peeled. It could still hold 15,000 souls, but the sense of magic was gone. The old fans came out of habit. They sat there with scarves that smelled of smoke and history, watching struggling teams that had forgotten their identity. A journalist wrote in 1974, "Olympia is still loud, but it's the kind of loud that covers disappointment." Bad drafts and worse management. The Red Wings of this era didn't just suffer from a lack of talent, it was leadership they lacked. Managers came and went. Coaches weren't given time. Draft after draft was missed, and the best young players preferred Montreal or Boston. Detroit had no direction. There were players who didn't even want to be traded to Detroit. That's how bad the reputation had become. Talk arose of selling, of relocation. A city that once proudly called itself Hockeytown threatened to lose its crown jewel. A city gone quiet. The dead years. From 1967 to 1982, the Red Wings reached the playoffs only twice. 2 times in 15 seasons. That wasn't a slump. That was a generational change that never happened. Fans grew up never knowing what championship joy felt like. An entire generation knew only failure. Children born in the 70s knew the Dead Wings before the Red Wings. On talk shows, they made jokes about them. Players like Dan Maloney, Marcel Dion, and Mickey Redmond tried to carry the burden, but without structure, without vision, talent is just a spark without fuel. Forgotten glory? The last shadow of Howe. Gordie Howe briefly returned, not in red, but in blue-gray, with the Houston Aeros alongside his 2 sons in the WHA. Detroit saw him play for another team, and that image felt like betrayal, even if only symbolically. Not because Howe did anything wrong, but because the club had let him go. It was the ultimate sign of how far the Red Wings had drifted from their own roots. A new home on the river. In 1979, the curtain fell on Olympia. The old hall, darkened, weathered, but remembered, received its final applause. It wasn't a farewell to a building, but to an era. Then, in December 1979, Joe Louis Arena opened its doors. Modern, sleek, built on the Detroit River, named after the legendary boxer and proud son of the city, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. It was a chance for rebirth, a symbol of something new. But symbols don't win games. Because although the building was different, the team remained the same. Lost, rudderless, divided against itself. New arena, old demons. The first seasons in the new stadium were difficult. The acoustics were different, the stands wider, the feeling more distant. Fans said that the Joe didn't yet have a soul. The Red Wings kept losing. Between 1980 and 1983, they were again one of the worst teams in the league. The stands filled with silence, and sometimes with whistled discontent. Detroit, once a city that believed in rebuilding, began to lose that belief here too. The only lights in the dark. Yet there were always figures who kept fighting. Players like Reed Larson, Danny Gare, Dale McCourt, men who played out of pride, not for glory. They didn't become champions, but they kept the flame alive. And there were the fans who kept coming, not because they thought they would win, but because leaving simply wasn't an option. In Detroit, they say, "You don't walk away from work halfway done." The end of the dark tunnel. By 1982, one new figure appeared on the horizon. Mike Ilitch, a former minor league baseball player and founder of Little Caesars Pizza, a local boy with a dream bigger than money to make the Red Wings Detroit's pride again. When Ilitch bought the club in 1982, he declared, "We're not just buying a hockey team, we're restoring a piece of Detroit's soul." What then sounded like marketing would later prove prophetic. Epilogue: The Ice of Memory. The years between 1967 and 1982 weren't just bad, they were necessary. Because only those who know complete despair can understand what rebirth means. The Red Wings had lost everything: identity, glory, direction. But the foundations were still there, deep in the steel, deep in the city, deep in the fans. Hockeytown wasn't dead. It was waiting. Images. A worker in 1982 taking his son to the Joe for the first time. Red light over the ice. A small boy looks up at the arena's roof and smiles. Voice. Sometimes, before rebirth, there must be darkness. Fade to black. The Yzerman era and rebuild, 1983 to 1996. Leadership creates identity. The camera glides over the gleaming exterior of Joe Louis Arena. The river shimmers in the sun. A little boy in a red sweater carries a stick over his shoulder, walking toward the stadium. After nearly 2 decades of darkness, Detroit was about to learn to believe again. A new owner, a new beginning. In 1982, Mike and Marian Ilitch took over the old worn brand of the Detroit Red Wings. They weren't business people who wanted to show off a sports team. They were Detroiters. Mike was born in the city, the son of Macedonian immigrants, once a minor league baseball player who knew what humility meant. He didn't look only at numbers or profits. He looked at the half-empty stands, at a city that had lost its pride. He said to his wife, "We're going to make this right. Detroit deserves something to believe in again." A name that would rewrite chapters. In 1983, during the NHL entry draft, the name was called that would change everything: Steve Yzerman, from the Peterborough Petes. He was just 18 years old, a slender boy with Canadian politeness and eyes that observed more than they spoke. But within a few weeks, scouts, coaches, and teammates knew this boy moved differently. Fast, precise, but above all, filled with calm amid chaos. He had the look of someone willing to suffer for growth, and no one recognizes that better than Detroit. The lessons of defeat. The early 80s were not yet miracle years. The Red Wings kept losing, but they had something they hadn't had in years: direction. Within 3 seasons, Yzerman took the captaincy, only 21 years old. He didn't have the voice of a leader, no theatrical speeches, no rage. His leadership weighed more than noise. It was example. Every practice like war. Every shift like a debt he had to repay to the history of the logo he wore. And slowly, the team began to breathe. The winged wheel began to turn again. The city that wanted to reinvent itself. At the same time, the city of Detroit also began a slow recovery. The auto industry gradually found rhythm again. Small businesses, jazz clubs, sports fields. Life was returning. The Red Wings became a symbol of that process, bruised but unbroken. The stands of Joe Louis Arena filled again, not because the Red Wings were already winning, but because they were fighting again. And for Detroit, that is the highest compliment. Scotty Bowman, the architect of structure. In the early 90s, when the Red Wings were recognizable again but not yet champions, a man arrived who knew what building meant: Scotty Bowman. He had already won cups in Montreal and Pittsburgh. He wasn't a charismatic motivator. He was a tactical brain, a man who spoke in systems, not emotions. He didn't believe in stars that shone individually, but in stars that enhanced one another. When he met Yzerman, he said, "If you want to lead champions, first learn to become part of one." Bowman's philosophy changed everything. Forecheck and backcheck became religion. Discipline became more important than flair. The team became a structure, not a collection of names. For fans, it took time to adjust. Less spectacle, more strategy. But the results began to come. The Russian Five, art on ice. Between 1995 and 1996, something came to Detroit that the NHL had never seen before. A quintet from another hockey universe, the Russian Five. Sergei Fedorov, elegance and precision; Slava Kozlov, finesse and confidence; Igor Larionov, the professor, master of game tempo; Slava Fetisov, defensive strength; Vladimir Konstantinov, relentless wall of steel. Bowman didn't accept chaos, but saw in them poetry in motion. Together, they created puck circulation that looked like dance. The audience was initially bewildered. This wasn't Canadian straight-line hockey, but game after game they proved that intelligence and cooperation could be just as devastating as brute force. They played with rhythm, conviction, and the calm of artists who didn't look at the clock. Detroit changed from grit and grind to grit combined with grace. Joe Louis Arena, the soul fills up. By now, the Joe was no longer a sterile building. It had become alive, a sea of sound and rhythm. Fans wore red up to the rafters. The air trembled with chants, "Let's go Red Wings." During crucial games, it felt as if the ice itself pulsed beneath the fans. Detroiters didn't come just to watch. They came to give energy back to their city through a team that reflected its soul, strength and precision, emotion and labor. The octopus, a tradition, becomes legend. In the mid-1940s, a bizarre symbol was born, the octopus. Once, a butcher from Detroit threw an octopus onto the ice at the start of the playoffs. 8 tentacles for the 8 wins, then needed to capture the Stanley Cup. The crowd laughed. The players won. Decades later, at every playoff game, octopuses once again rained down onto the ice at the Joe. For outsiders, it was strange. For Detroit, it was ritual, a smile to history, and a promise never to forget where it began. From struggle to mastery. From 1993 onward, the Red Wings were no longer outsiders. They were top teams. Players like Nicklas Lidstrom, the Swedish machine of elegance and order, Darren McCarty, the fighter with flair, and Chris Osgood, the calm young goalie, all fit into the puzzle of a team coming of age. Yet one curse hung in the air, decades without a Stanley Cup, since 1955. Everyone felt it. It had to end. And in Yzerman's eyes, you could see the fire that had never gone out, the fire of 20 years of waiting. Experience as Foundation Bowman's system worked its way deep into the team's DNA. There was no star greater than the team. At practice, Yzerman still skated the hardest, even though he was an all-star. Younger players later said, "If the captain does that, who am I not to?" The ethos of Detroit returned to the ice level. Work hard, stay silent, get better. On the threshold of a dynasty. By the mid-1990s, everything was in place. A new generation born from the darkness of '82. A captain hardened by losing. A coach obsessed with perfection. And a city that had found its voice again. The Red Wings were no longer the Dead Wings. They were once more the Red Wings, ready to prove that faith, discipline, and suffering lead to legacy. Images, Yzerman smiling in the tunnels, fans waving red and white, the logo gleaming under spotlights. Leadership creates identity, and identity builds dynasties. The dynasty returns, 1997 to 2008. Emotion meets perfection. Images, night over Detroit. The river reflects the lights. In Joe Louis Arena, the ice crackles under sharp skates. A huge crowd sings. The voice is low and calm. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of hope. And then came the night when everything returned to where it belonged. In red, 1997. The year of liberation. It wasn't an ordinary season. The city felt that something was coming. The Red Wings played tighter, smarter, more emotional than ever. Yzerman, now mature, transformed from star to mentor. Bowman's system ran in the DNA of every line. Lidstrom conducted from the back with silent perfection. Shanahan, Draper, McCarty, and Maltby provided the heartbeat of the team. Every game felt like payment on a debt, half a century without a trophy. Fans barely dared to hope aloud. But on June 7th, 1997, it happened. Game 4, Detroit versus Philadelphia. The clock ticked to 0. Confetti fell onto the ice of the Joe. The Red Wings won their first Stanley Cup since 1955. The crowd erupted as if the city itself exhaled after 42 years underwater. Tears, shouts, songs, "Let's go Red Wings," echoed across the river deep into the night. An old factory worker said, "We thought we'd lost everything, and then that team reminded us who we are." Vladimir Konstantinov, the tragedy of a champion. Less than a week later, tragedy struck like a shadow over the euphoria. Defenseman Vladimir Konstantinov, the Russian pillar of steel and discipline, was involved in a severe car accident. He survived, but suffered serious brain injuries. Detroit was paralyzed. The city that had just learned to cheer now learned to cry again. Yet that sorrow turned into another kind of unity. The team kept his name alive. Every player wore a patch with the initials VK/16. After every win, they shouted, "This one's for Vladdy." 1998. The Cup for Konstantinov. The following year, Detroit played with something no training plan could match: a mission. Every shift, every hit, every goal was dedicated to their friend in a wheelchair, sitting on the sidelines smiling, eyes full of fire. The Red Wings repeated their championship. 2 consecutive Stanley Cups. The final game ended with an image burned into every Detroit fan's memory. The Stanley Cup, resting on Konstantinov's lap, held by teammates with tears in their eyes. No trophy in sports history ever carried such weight. Detroit celebrated, but with reverence. It wasn't merely a victory, it was a triumph over fate itself. Between triumph and transition. In the years that followed, the Red Wings remained among the elite, but the NHL was changing. Salary caps, new rules, more speed. Bowman adapted, and Ilitch kept investing with unmatched dedication to quality. The Red Wings became the model of how a franchise is built, not through luck, but through culture. There was no city, no organization that worked harder to keep winning. 2002, the super team. When Mike Ilitch in 2001 brought in players like Dominik Hasek, Luc Robitaille, Brett Hull, and Brendan Shanahan, alongside Yzerman, Lidstrom, Fedorov, and Larionov, people called it hockey's all-star experiment. But for Detroit, it was something else: ambition with memory. They wanted to show again that excellence can coexist with humility. Scotty Bowman called it the most complete team I ever coached. The team didn't disappoint. They stormed through the season, outclassing opponents with experience, control, and rhythm. When the Stanley Cup was lifted again in 2002, there was no luck left in the story. It was organizational art. Bowman, as a final act, skated onto the ice, the old general, smiling, almost fatherly. He had not only won games, he had transformed people. The city lives again. Detroit in the early 2000s felt like a city with renewed self-respect. Cars rolled off the lines again, but more importantly, people wore red. T-shirts, flags, stickers, tattoos. The wing became identity. Joe Louis Arena was loud enough every night to make the river tremble. It wasn't just an arena, it was a sacred crossroads of sport, labor, and heritage. A father showed his son what struggle meant. A grandmother told stories from 1955 while her grandson watched the ice ignite. The Red Wings had come to mirror their city again, and this time, in color. 2008, the last crown of an era. After several years of rebuilding and new rules following the lockout, the team in 2008 once more came together with the old spirit of perfection. The roles had shifted, Yzerman now in management, but his presence lingered everywhere. On the ice, Nicklas Lidstrom led as the new captain, calm and brilliant. Henrik Zetterberg, Pavel Datsyuk, and Chris Osgood formed the spine of a team that fused technological precision with soul. They crushed Pittsburgh in the final. When Lidstrom raised the Stanley Cup, a new generation of Detroiters ran into the streets. For many, their first true memory of championship. It felt like the closing movement of a symphony, from 1926 to 2008, from steel to glory, from fracture to unity. The impact of a dynasty. By the late 2000s, it could no longer be denied. The Detroit Red Wings were the most successful American franchise in NHL history. 4 Stanley Cups in 11 years, and more importantly, an identity that connected generations. What began as a logo on a jersey had become a philosophy of life. Work hard, be loyal, stay proud. Epilogue. The silence of the Joe. The final shots of this era show the Joe Louis Arena in twilight. Empty seats, silent ice, an old man looking across the stands and smiling. His son stands beside him, wearing a brand new Lidstrom jersey. For years, we dreamed of this. Now it's our turn to remember where it came from. The camera pulls back over the river. The city glows in red. Modern era and Little Caesars Arena, 2017 to present. A new home, a city reborn, a legacy carried forward. Slow drone footage over Detroit at sunrise. Glass towers reflect light across the river. The camera zooms in on a gleaming structure with a red heart, Little Caesars Arena. In a city that reinvented itself, its soul too needed a new roof. Farewell to Joe Louis Arena. The last time the Red Wings took the ice at Joe Louis Arena, no seat remained empty. No voice stayed silent. Old jerseys, new faces, generations side by side. Everyone knew what it meant. The Joe wasn't a building. It was a time capsule of 40 years of belief. Under its steel roof, legends had grown. Yzerman, Fedorov, Lidstrom, Datsyuk, Zetterberg. Fans said goodbye through tears, songs, and memories. One fan said in a TV interview, "This place raised us. We grew up under those banners." The crowd sang long after the final siren, not as an ending, but a passing of the torch. Little Caesars Arena, the new cathedral. In the fall of 2017, the new home opened, Little Caesars Arena. Postmodern on the outside, warm and inviting on the inside. The design, steel, glass, red marble, was a tribute to Detroit's architectural past.
The memories we've made in this iconic building are endless, and these guys here tonight all had something to do.
Facts and symbolism. Capacity, nearly 20,000 cost.
It was a wake, not a funeral. The fans came for one last night just to live this place where they grew up one more time.
$863 million fully integrated into the district Detroit.
These fans are still out there cheering for us and making the atmosphere unbelievable.
That's why they call it Hockeytown.
A zone where sports, music, and culture converge. An open concourse so fans never lose sight of the ice circular seating rows. A central video halo glowing like fire above the rink. The wing at center ice, larger than ever, reflected on the surface as if history itself were watching. The modern fans, the heirs of Hockeytown. On game days, Detroit feels different. As if the city holds its breath, waiting for the first drop of the puck. Long before the doors of Little Caesars Arena open, downtown fills with red. Cafes, rooftops, street vendors, everywhere you see wings. Cars drive by with flags waving from the windows, honking in rhythm. Kids wear oversized jerseys. Grandfathers don caps with the faded logo of Olympia Stadium. Everyone knows everyone on those days, even if they pretend not to. The scent of charcoal and pizza lingers between buildings. Beer flows, biting against the cold air. People don't talk about work or politics, but about lines, power plays, injuries, about our team. The Red Wings are the conversation, as they always have been. Inside Little Caesars Arena, the experience continues with a blend that only Detroit seems to master. Modern spectacle with an old soul. The lights dim, the ceiling glows red. A pulsing beat shakes the hall as screens flash with images of Howe's elbows, Yzerman's smile, Datsyuk's magic. Everyone knows what's coming. The team introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, your Detroit Red Wings. The crowd explodes. Hands smack seats, feet stomp rhythm. The stadium literally shakes. Then the opening face-off. 1 second of silence, followed by the thunderous voice of 20,000 people. Let's go Red Wings. 3 words, generations old, still sharp as steel. Sound, light, and heartbeat. When Detroit scores, the goal horn sounds deep, electric, more engine than horn. It rumbles through chest and concrete, followed by the iconic woo-hoo from Blur's Song 2. The crowd jumps in unison, a wave rippling through the stands. Sometimes red towels roll down from the upper rows like miniature storms over the crowd. Lights flash. The whole arena sings the chorus as if it were a battle song. There are also the in-between anthems, traditions you know if you've ever been there. During intermissions comes Journey's Don't Stop Believin', and the city belts out Born and Raised in South Detroit as if it were a national anthem. Or Sweet Caroline, where the Ba 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 makes the stands dance. In some playoff games, Seven Nation Army, fittingly from the White Stripes, a Detroit band, echoes through the rafters, and the "Oh-oh-oh-oh" chant fills the air like a ritual call. And then there's the octopus moment. Though it's no longer officially allowed to throw one on the ice, the tradition lives on. Plastic replicas in the concourse, flags with 8 arms, collectibles named Al the Octopus, the legendary symbol that began in the 1950s, a mascot for the 8 wins once needed to claim the cup. Now, a giant purple octopus hangs permanently inside the arena, above the stands, a reminder of that stubborn spirit. Detroit never forgets. The people in the crowd. What truly makes Hockeytown special is the fan. It's not a crowd of glamour, but a gathering of hard workers, students, families, nurses, mechanics. They don't come for spectacle, but for connection. They don't cheer just for goals. They applaud a blocked shot, a smart dump, a goalie's last-second save. They know the game in detail because their parents taught them how to watch. And even though the arena is modern, the fan behavior remains pure old Detroit. Respect the opponent, but not too much. Cheer for the team, not yourself. Stay until the end, no matter the score. When a player is hurt, silence falls. When he rises again, a roaring ovation follows, no matter who he is or where he's from. That's honor. That's work ethic. That's Detroit. After the game, after the final buzzer, people drift out slowly, but no one rushes. They greet strangers with fingers raised in the air. Go Wings! The sounds of the crowd fade into the rumble of cars heading back down Woodward Avenue, red light reflecting off wet asphalt. For many, that moment is the best one, tired from adrenaline but full of warmth, because for those few hours, Detroit has felt like one city, with no line between work and play, past and future. In Hockeytown, being a fan doesn't mean watching, it means participating. Every shout, every beat, every octopus in the air is a new line in the same old story. The city lives, the team lives, and together they keep fighting. It's not just hockey, says a boy in a Red Wings beanie near the exit. It's what Detroit breathes. The new wind, a city and team rebuilt. Along with the new arena came a new chapter on the management level. In 2019, Steve Yzerman returned, this time not as a player, but as general manager. A homecoming that felt like poetry. The man who once led on the ice now vowed to lead the team through rebuilding. His mission, not short-term success, but to rebuild culture as Bowman once taught, structural, methodical, worthy of Detroit. Under his leadership arrived a new generation. Dylan Larkin, born in Michigan, became captain and symbol of hope. Moritz Cedar, Lucas Raymond, Alex DeBrincat, young talents with fire in their eyes and respect for tradition. They wear the same wing, but in an era of data and speed. The foundation is as old as the steel of the city itself. Work hard, stay humble, never quit. The city transforms. From steel to style, Detroit itself is also undergoing a renaissance. New investments, art, technology, music festivals. The old warehouses along the river turn into cafes, galleries, and startups. Yet the beating core remains the same. The Red Wings are the fabric that connects generations, a reminder of who Detroit was, and a compass for what it can become. When the team plays, it still feels as if the city beats with one heartbeat. The sounds of now on game days, downtown hums, cars with red flags, families in Yzerman or Larkin sweaters, the scent of pizza, beer, and cold air. Inside, the new goal horn roars, short, thunderous, electric. The crowd chants, phones light up, and somewhere between the LED panels still echoes the old woohoo of fans who once stood in the Joe. Tradition doesn't disappear, it adapts. The legacy of the wing. At the entrances hang photos of the old heroes: Howe, Lindsay, Abel, Yzerman, Lidstrom. Beneath each plaque, a quote about work, loyalty, humility. It's more than nostalgia, it's instruction. Every player who walks in understands what the jersey means. The wing doesn't stand for luxury, it stands for coming back again and again. Hockeytown today. Detroit still proudly calls itself Hockeytown. Not just because of cups or records, but because of what the game represents. Rough hands with soft hearts, honor in effort, belief that resilience conquers all. The mood in the city is hopeful. Everyone knows rebuilding takes time, and in Detroit, people know how to wait and work at the same time. When Yzerman stands by the boards watching, quieter than ever, it feels as though the circle is complete. The boy from 1983 is now the guardian of 2024, the Wings of Detroit. Slow montage, factories in backlight, the scrape of skates on fresh ice, children practicing behind their houses, fans lighting the city red at night. From factories to frozen ice, from Howe to Lidstrom, from falling to rising again. The wing flies once more because it never truly fell. The chants outside the arena grow louder. Let's go Red Wings! The camera rises above the red sea of light, looking down at the city. On the facade of the arena, the logo glows, bright as ever. Fade to black. One line appears. The Detroit Red Wings are not just a team, they are Hockeytown. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are many more special, untold, and historic stories coming your way. Tell me in the comments which team you'd like to see featured in the next video.